In 1346, a Mongol army besieging the city of Caffa began dying faster than the people trapped behind its walls. Caffa was a fortified Genoese trading colony on the southeastern coast of the Crimean Peninsula, jutting out into the Black Sea. Inside two rings of stone walls, roughly 15 to 20,000 merchant sailors, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, and Tatar residents had been under siege for the better part of a year. Outside those walls sat an encampment nearly the size of a small city. Tens of thousands of Mongol Tatar troops belonging to Khan Jani Beg of the Golden Horde. His army ringed Caffa on the landward side, cutting off every overland road. But something had gone wrong in the Khan's camp. His men were dying, and they were not dying from Genoese crossbows. Then, according to a chronicle written 2 years later in Italy, the Khan made a decision that has haunted history ever since. He ordered his siege engineers to load the swollen, blackening bodies of his own dead soldiers onto his trebuchets, massive counterweight catapults built to hurl boulders across 2 football fields of open ground. He ordered them hurled instead over Caffa's outer walls. If he could not break the city by force, he would infect it. A few weeks later, Genoese galleys fled the harbor and sailed west. A year after that, plague-ridden ships arrived at Sicily. Within 5 years, somewhere between a third and a half of every man, woman, and child in Europe was dead. For 7 centuries, this scene at Caffa has been called the first documented act of biological warfare in history. You will find it cited in modern military academies and biodefense curricula, and in almost every popular history of the Black Death. The story is short, terrible, and easy to picture. One Khan, one decision, one continent erased. But is that really what happened? Did those corpses arcing over Caffa's walls actually ignite the deadliest pandemic in European history? Or has one dramatic image described by a single Italian notary hundreds of miles away been quietly obscuring something else that was already in motion? To answer that, we have to walk back nearly a century to a time when there wasn't yet a place on the map called Caffa. In 1266, a delegation from the Republic of Genoa struck a deal with the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was the westernmost of the great Mongol Khanates, the successor state to the empire Genghis Khan had built, ruling a vast stretch of grassland from the lower Danube in Eastern Europe to the fringes of Central Asia. Its Khans lived in a mobile capital on the lower Volga and controlled the caravan routes feeding the Silk Road into Europe. In exchange for tribute payments and trade privileges, the Khan granted the Genoese permission to build a colony on a natural harbor on the Crimean coast. They called it Caffa. At the time, this was not headline news, but it quietly became one of the most consequential land agreements of the medieval world. Here's why. Overland trade coming out of China, Persia, and the Central Asian markets, silk, spices, precious metals, and above all, human beings, funneled north and west through Mongol territory and converged on the Black Sea. Grain from the enormous, fertile hinterlands of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia piled up in warehouses along the northern coast. On the other side of the water, Italy, booming, urban, and hungry, needed all of it. And Caffa sat exactly at the seam between the two systems. The overland caravans ended there. The sea routes to Constantinople, Genoa, Venice, and every port between them began there. Whoever controlled Caffa controlled the pipeline. For roughly 200 years after 1266, that meant Genoa. But it also meant that whenever the Khan of the Golden Horde was unhappy with his Italian tenants, Caffa was the pressure point he could reach for. And the Italian merchants gave the Khans plenty of reasons to be unhappy. In 1308, Khan Tokta besieged and sacked Caffa over an ongoing dispute about the Genoese slave trade, specifically the Italian practice of buying Tatar captives from steppe raiders and shipping them off to Mediterranean markets. Caffa fell. The Genoese scattered to their ships. But Tokta died a few years later, and his successor, Khan Uzbeg, decided there was more profit in Italian trade than in Italian ruins. He let the Genoese come back. And when they came back, they rebuilt Caffa properly. 2 concentric stone walls, one behind the other. A deep outer ditch. Defensive towers spaced around the perimeter, each capable of mounting a ballista or a stone-throwing engine. By the 1340s, Caffa was widely considered nearly impregnable to a standard Mongol cavalry assault. That fact will matter enormously when we return to the siege. Because the walls, in the end, will hold. The city itself will not fall to Mongol arms. Something else will get in. Now the second piece of context you need. Around the same time Caffa was being rebuilt, something far quieter was beginning to move across the same map. Sometime around the 1330s, historians estimate, the bacterium we now call Yersinia pestis began expanding out of its long-established reservoirs in Central Asia. The best current scientific evidence points to the mountain steppes around Lake Isikul in modern Kyrgyzstan, or possibly further south on the Tibetan plateau. Y. pestis is not primarily a human disease. It lives in wild rodent populations, marmots, gerbils, ground squirrels. It moves between rodents through the bite of fleas that feed on them. Most of the time, it stays quietly in the background of the steppe ecosystem, killing rodents in cycles that no human ever notices. But when a rodent population crashes or a colony migrates, the fleas start looking for new hosts. And when those new hosts happen to be the black rats, Rattus rattus, living in the grain warehouses and ship holds of a busy trading city, something else begins to happen. The disease starts moving with human commerce. Every caravan is a potential carrier. Every grain sack is a potential incubator. Every warehouse is a potential outbreak zone. And in the 1330s and 1340s, human commerce was moving fast. The Golden Horde's trade caravans, the Silk Road hubs of Central Asia, the Black Sea ports, all of them were connected by the same overland networks Yersinia pestis was quietly riding along. By the time our story reaches its central crisis, plague had already appeared in the steppe cities east of the Volga. It was working its way west, one caravan stop at a time. The coast was ahead. That brings us back to the war. In the autumn of 1343, a violent brawl broke out in the streets of Tana, another Italian trading colony on the mouth of the Don River, a few days' sail from Caffa. Tana was in some ways Caffa's smaller cousin, a shared grain and slave market, where Venetian, Genoese, and Tatar merchants worked side by side and occasionally ended up at each other's throats. On this day, according to the primary sources, a group of Italian merchants killed a prominent Mongol official, a tax collector, by most accounts, during a street fight. That was the spark. The surviving Italians fled Tana by galley, made for Caffa, and barricaded themselves inside its walls. And Khan Yani Beg, a young, ambitious ruler who had taken the throne of the Golden Horde only a year earlier, declared formal war on the Genoese colonies of Crimea. His terms were straightforward. He wanted the fugitives handed over. He wanted the Italian merchants to accept the Khan's tax authority. And he wanted, more broadly, to reassert Mongol sovereignty over a Black Sea trade network that Genoa had spent 80 years quietly making its own. The Genoese refused. In February 1344, Johnny Beg launched his first formal siege of Caffa. His army rolled up in front of the walls. Siege engines behind them, tents spreading across the steppe. He probably expected the city to fold. It did not. The size of that first Mongol force is disputed. De Mussi, the Italian chronicler we will return to, and by then you'll understand why, claims tens of thousands of Mongol Tatar troops. No independent record survives to confirm that number. What we do know is that the siege failed. A Genoese relief fleet arrived from Italy in the middle of the campaign, punched through the coastal blockade, and according to the same chronicle, enabled a Genoese sortie out of the city gates that killed something like 15,000 Mongol soldiers. That figure, too, is disputed. It comes from a single hostile Italian source with every reason to inflate it. But the outcome itself is not in doubt. Yani Beg pulled back. He did not, however, go away. Through the rest of 1344 and into 1345, he reorganized. He raised a larger force. He learned from the way the first siege had ended from the fact that Caffa's walls could not be broken from the land, and that Italian ships had been able to smash the coastal blockade. Then in the summer of 1345, he marched back to Crimea to begin the second siege. This one would be different. This one would last more than a year. It would cut Caffa off from every overland road and force the city to survive on whatever the sea could smuggle in. And by the time it ended, it would seed a story that 7 centuries of historians would repeat, and that modern scholars are only now beginning to unpick. The second siege of Caffa did not look like the first one. Janni Beg had learned. This time he did not gamble on a quick storming of the walls. He settled in. By the late summer of 1345, his army had spread out along the entire landward perimeter of the city, a semi-permanent encampment of yurts, timber siege works, corrals, and cookfires stretching from the walls of Caffa out onto the open Pontic steppe. Every overland road was cut. Every caravan trying to reach the city was turned back, seized, or destroyed. For the roughly 15,000 to 20,000 people trapped inside, only one lifeline remained: the sea. For a while, that was enough. Genoese ships slipped in and out of the harbor, keeping the city fed on grain shipped down from the Bosphorus. But maritime supply was expensive, and it was slow. Prices climbed inside the walls. Rations thinned. Winter came. Then another winter after it. And Janni Beg was still there, squatting on the horizon, waiting. Then in the spring of 1346, something began killing the Mongols. The chroniclers describe it clinically, even before they understand what they are seeing. Soldiers who had been healthy at morning muster were dying by evening. Fevers came first, then swellings under the arms and in the groin, hard, painful lumps the size of eggs. Then dark patches on the skin, black or purple, as if the flesh were rotting under the surface. In some cases, blood came up from the lungs. In almost every case, the man was dead within a day or two. Mongol physicians who had traveled with the army had no name for it, no treatment for it, and no way to stop it from moving from tent to tent. By high summer, the daily death toll in the camp was catastrophic. De Mussi, writing about this from Italy 2 years later, would claim thousands of Mongol dead every single day. Even if that figure is an exaggeration, and it probably is, the qualitative picture is clear. The army was collapsing from the inside. The disease was killing them faster than any Genoese sortie ever had. Traditional Mongol burial rites, which required ritual attention to each body, simply broke down under the sheer volume. Corpses piled up in the summer heat of the steppe. Flies, stench, panic. So what was killing them? This is where our two threads finally meet. Remember the disease we followed through its westward migration? Yersinia pestis, the bacterium moving quietly out of the Central Asian steppe reservoirs along caravan routes toward the Black Sea. By 1346, it had arrived. Whether it reached Janni Beg's camp through infected caravan drivers, rodents living in the food stores, or fleas jumping from marmots taken as game, historians still argue about the exact route. What is not disputed is that plague reached the besiegers of Caffa before it reached Caffa itself. And this is where the most famous scene in the entire story unfolds. According to Gabriele de Mussi, and the phrasing matters, because he is nearly our only source. Khan Janni Beg, watching his army disintegrate around him, refused to simply retreat in humiliation. Instead, he ordered his siege engineers to turn the dead into weapons. Picture the trebuchets. These were the largest siege engines the medieval world had produced. Counterweight machines with wooden throwing arms 20 or 30 feet long, powered by enormous boxes of stone that dropped through a downward arc and whipped the sling forward at the top. A trebuchet of this class could hurl a stone weighing 100 kilograms or more across a distance of 150 to 200 meters, roughly the length of 2 football pitches. It was the artillery of its time. It was designed to break walls. Janni Beg told his crews to load the machines with the bodies of his own dead soldiers. De Mussi's Latin translated describes it this way: the Tartars, exhausted by the disaster of such a great evil and stunned by the fatal plague, projected the corpses of the dead by machines into the city of Caffa so that the people might perish from the intolerable stench. Bodies arcing over the outer walls. Bodies breaking open on impact in the streets and courtyards of the merchants' city. Bodies piling up on rooftops and in wells. According to the chronicle, the defenders of Caffa dumped as many corpses as they could into the harbor. But there were too many. And soon, de Mussi tells us, the Genoese themselves began to sicken and die. For 7 centuries, that has been the image. The corpse in the sky. The Khan's revenge. The moment biological warfare enters recorded history, and the moment the Black Death enters Europe. It is a scene that has survived in military academies' textbooks and television documentaries. It is easy to visualize and impossible to forget. There is only one problem with it. Here is what everyone remembers about the catapulted corpses. The stench of the rotting bodies poisoned the air of Caffa, and the plague spread from that poisoned air into the defenders. This is exactly how de Mussi presents it. The people, he writes, would perish from the intolerable stench. Except plague does not spread that way. Yersinia pestis is not an airborne disease under most conditions. It does not travel on smells. It does not seep out of decaying flesh into human lungs. In its most common form, bubonic plague, the form with the black swellings that everyone describes, it needs a very specific delivery system, the bite of an infected flea. And here is where the epidemiology quietly undoes the myth. When a body cools after death, the fleas living on it detect the change and start looking for a new warm-blooded host. If a fresh Mongol corpse hit a Caffan rooftop with living infected fleas still on it, which is possible, if the body was recent enough, then yes, some of those fleas could have jumped to a passing defender. But this is an extraordinarily inefficient way to move a disease into a population. A single warehouse of infected rats will do more transmission in a week than 1,000 catapulted corpses will do in a month. And Caffa, in the autumn of 1346, was full of warehouses. Because here is what the mythology has been quietly obscuring for 700 years. Caffa was not an isolated fortress being infected for the first time by a Mongol projectile. Caffa was a hub. For months before Johnny Beg's catapults ever swung, Caffa's own maritime supply lines had been carrying grain in from the Black Sea and out to the Bosphorus. Those grain shipments came with rats. Those rats came with fleas. The same continental network that had brought the plague to Johnny Beg's camp had also almost certainly been quietly seeding it in Caffa's own docks holds and food stores. The catapulting scene may or may not have happened. The mechanism it described, the plague crossing the walls and a body arcing through the air, is, in the end, a dramatic detail. The disease was already coming through the harbor. By late autumn of 1346, the siege was over. Not because Caffa had fallen, and not because Johnny Beg had won. His army had been shattered by the same illness that was now spreading inside the city he had failed to break. The Mongol force pulled back onto the steppe to regroup or to die. And inside Caffa, the surviving Genoese made a decision that would echo across the Mediterranean. They ran. In November, the merchant galleys of Caffa raised anchor, loaded whatever cargo they could, grain, valuables, refugees, and invisibly, in the holds, thousands of black rats and their fleas, and set sail southwest, aiming for the narrow channel of the Bosphorus and the ports of home. These were not in any meaningful sense criminals or fugitives. They were merchants, going back to their creditors, their families, their businesses. They had survived a 2-year siege. They were carrying the harvest of 2 years' worth of trade. They were, in their own eyes, coming home. They did not know what they were bringing with them. The route from Caffa to Italy in the winter of 1346 to 1347 ran along the northern arc of the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus into the Sea of Marmara past Constantinople, and out through the Dardanelles into the Aegean. From there, ships fanned out, some toward the Levant, some toward Crete and Cyprus, some toward Sicily, some pushing further west toward Genoa and Marseille. Every port a ship touched was a chance for infected rats to slip down a mooring line onto a dock. Every warehouse a sack of grain was unloaded into was a chance for the disease to establish a new foothold. The Mediterranean in this moment was not a barrier, it was a delivery system. By May of 1347, plague outbreaks were being formally recorded in Constantinople. The Byzantine imperial administration, already weakened by a civil war that had ended only a few years earlier, could not contain it. The disease jumped from Constantinople into the Aegean shipping lanes, into the Levantine trading ports of the Crusader coast, and westward along the sea routes that had spent centuries linking the Byzantine world to Italy. Then, in October of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys arrived at the port of Messina on the northeastern tip of Sicily. The scene at the docks was recorded by a Sicilian Franciscan friar named Michele da Piazza, writing in his Chronicle of Sicily some years later. According to his account, the harbor masters of Messina boarded the ships, expecting to inspect a normal cargo of Black Sea grain. What they found instead was rows of dead men slumped at their oars, and a handful of survivors covered in black swellings, coughing blood, unable to stand. The harbor authorities panicked. They ordered the ships expelled from the port and sent back to sea. But by the time the order was given, the rats had already come ashore. Fleas were already jumping to the dock workers who had helped tie the ships up. Grain was already being unloaded onto Sicilian carts. The Black Death had entered Western Europe. Within a few weeks, plague was in Palermo. Within a few months, it was in every major port along the Sicilian and southern Italian coasts. In November and December, more Genoese ships coming back from the Black Sea and the Levant reached the docks at Genoa and Marseille, and coastal cities across the northern Mediterranean became simultaneous centers of dissemination. From the coast, the plague pushed inland along rivers, pilgrimage roads, fair circuits, every human network that connected one town to the next. By the end of 1348, most of Italy, southern France, and eastern Spain were already engulfed. Within 5 years, the disease would have killed something between 25 and 30 million people, depending on which estimate you trust, between 30 and 50% of everyone alive in Europe. Which brings us, at last, to Piacenza. Piacenza is a small city in Lombardy, in northern Italy, about 70 kilometers southeast of Milan. It sits on the Po River, a long way from Caffa and a long way from Messina, but very much on the roads and rivers along which news and infection traveled in the spring of 1348. In the first months of that year, as the plague began sweeping through Lombardy, an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi sat down to write. You have to understand who de Mussi was and who he was not. He was a professional legal writer, a man whose job was drawing up contracts, recording property transactions, and certifying documents. He was educated literate in Latin, and by every indication, deeply religious. He was also, as far as we can tell, entirely a man of Piacenza. He had not been to Caffa. He had not been on any of the fleeing galleys. He had never set foot on the Crimean coast, never seen a Mongol siege engine, and never spoken to Khan Johnny Beg. Everything he wrote about the East, he wrote from his desk in Lombardy, based on what he could hear from sailors and travelers passing through northern Italy. And what he wrote over the first months of 1348 was a chronicle titled Historia de Morbo, the history of the disease. He wrote it, above all, as a work of theology. For de Mussi, the plague could not simply be a biological accident. It had to mean something. It had to be, in his framing, a divine judgment, a scourge sent by God to punish Christendom for its sins, delivered by the hands of the heathen East and carried back to Europe by Christian merchants who had grown greedy trading among the infidels. He needed a narrative that would make sense of the horror flooding into every parish around him. He needed an origin story. And for that origin story to work, it had to be dramatic. It had to have a villain. It had to have a moment. The moment he chose was the catapulted corpse. We do not know, and probably never will know, how much of the corpse catapulting scene is something de Mussi actually heard from a returning sailor, and how much is something he built up in the writing, the way a medieval Latin author reaching for classical models might have layered detail onto rumor to make a scene land. What we do know is that his single manuscript is the source, not one of the other chroniclers of the Black Death, and there are many mentions of Caffa's catapulted corpses. No Genoese colonial record confirms it. No Mongol source in the languages that survive to us describes it. The event, if it happened, entered European consciousness through one man in Piacenza, writing about a city he had never seen, quoting witnesses whose names he never gave. Historians have been reading that manuscript and repeating it ever since. By the spring of 1348, de Mussi had finished. He put the manuscript aside. It would circulate quietly in medical and monastic libraries for centuries. It would be edited and reprinted, cited and repeated, translated and dramatized. And its central scene, Johnny Beg's corpses arcing over the walls of Caffa, would become one of the most famous images in the history of medicine and war. But behind that scene, another story had been unfolding all along. It just did not have a notary in Piacenza to write it down. That other story, the one no notary bothered to write down, is what modern historians have spent the last 2 decades reconstructing. And to see it, you have to stop looking at the trebuchets and start looking at the ships. Here is what happened in the winter of 1346 to 1347, according to the reconstruction scholars like Hannah Barker at Arizona State University and Ole Benedicto at the University of Oslo have pieced together. It is less dramatic than de Mussi's version, but it is far more damning because it does not require a single villain, a single evil order, or even a single moment. It requires only a normal, functioning medieval trade network doing exactly what it was designed to do. The Genoese galleys that fled Caffa in November were not carrying a mysterious curse. They were carrying grain. Grain from the enormous fertile hinterlands of Crimea and the Sea of Azov, some of the richest wheat-growing land in the medieval world. That grain was piled into the below-deck holds of the ships in bulk. Bulk grain holds are, from the point of view of a black rat, one of the most perfect habitats ever engineered by human hands. They are warm. They are dark. They are full of food. And once one pregnant female ratus climbs on board during loading, something that happened in ports across the medieval Mediterranean, she can produce a small colony within weeks. Some of those rats were carrying fleas. Some of those fleas were carrying Yersinia pestis. And this is where the epidemiology becomes ruthless. Once plague is established in a shipboard rat colony, it does what it does anywhere else. It kills the rats. And when the rats start dying, the fleas start jumping. On a moving ship, the only other warm bodies available are the crew. And the only other stops are the ports. The Caffa galleys did not need a Khan's catapult to become plague ships. They only needed to be loaded normally, sail normally, and dock normally. Every warehouse they unloaded into inherited the rats. Every port they touched inherited the fleas. The disease was moving on the trade route because the trade route was the disease's vehicle. And the trade route did not begin at Caffa. It began wherever the plague had first reached the grain circuit, most likely somewhere on the northern Black Sea coast, months before the siege even ended. This is why modern scholars keep making the same point when they revisit de Mussi. Even if Johnny Beg's catapults did exactly what the chronicle says, and it is genuinely possible some corpses were thrown as an act of psychological terror, if nothing else, the effect on the pandemic was in the largest sense negligible. The plague was going to reach Italy either way. It was already loaded into the grain holds. It was already on the docks. It was already at sea. The catapulted corpse is a story about a moment. The rat in the grain hold is a story about a system, and the system is what killed Europe. There is a strange comfort in some ways in the older version, de Mussi's version. A comfort that historians think helps explain why it survived so long. If the Black Death was caused by a specific Mongol Khan making a specific evil decision on a specific afternoon in 1346, then the horror has a cause, a name, and a face. It becomes something that can be blamed. It becomes, in the deepest sense, a story with a villain. De Mussi, sitting at his desk in Piacenza while his neighbors died around him, was writing precisely that kind of story, one where an unimaginable natural catastrophe could be explained as the result of human wickedness, delivered as divine punishment, and understood as something that made moral sense. The reality is harder to hold. The reality is that nobody meant to kill 25 million people. The men on those ships were merchants going home, and the pandemic was carried by the same commercial network that had brought silk to European wardrobes, spices to European tables, and grain to European bakeries, the same network Genoa had built, and that everyone, including the Khans of the Golden Horde, had spent decades trying to protect. The disease did not enter Europe on a projectile. It entered Europe in a sack of wheat. And once you see that, several other pieces of the myth come apart along with it. Take the idea that Johnny Beg invented biological warfare at Caffa. It is a striking claim, and it is repeated everywhere. It is also historically not true. The use of putrid or contaminated materials in siege warfare goes back centuries before Caffa, in traditions across Greece, Rome, and China. Ancient armies routinely poisoned enemy wells with animal carcasses. Fortress defenders in the classical Mediterranean threw diseased corpses back over their own walls to demoralize besiegers. What was unique about Caffa was not the tactic, it was the timing, the coincidence of a siege event with the beginning of the Second Plague pandemic. That coincidence is what made the story travel. It is not what made it original. Or take de Mussi himself, who is still sometimes described in popular accounts as an eyewitness, as though he had been in Caffa during the siege, on one of the fleeing galleys, or in Messina when the ships arrived. He was none of those things. He was a notary in Lombardy, working with harbor reports and traveler testimony, applying the literary tools of a medieval Latin chronicler to material he had received secondhand. This does not make him a liar. It does not even make him unreliable on many of the events he describes. But it does mean that the corpse catapulting scene, the piece of his account that has traveled furthest and been repeated most, is something he was told about rather than something he saw. And no other independent source we have, Genoese, Byzantine, Sicilian, or Mongol, describes it. Or take the folk memory that still sometimes connects the plague to nursery rhymes and macabre imagery. The idea that Ring Around the Rosie is about plague buboes, for example, or that the medieval Dance of Death frescoes were painted specifically in response to the Black Death. Folklorists tend to be skeptical of the rhyme connection. The earliest recorded versions of Ring Around the Rosie appear centuries too late to be a reliable plague memory. The Dance of Death, by contrast, really did emerge in the aftermath of the pandemic. A late medieval visual tradition in which skeletons dance beside emperors, bishops, merchants, and peasants, dragging every rank of society into the same grave. That imagery captured something real about the plague that de Mussi's chronicle missed. The catastrophe did not respect walls, catapults, cons, or notaries. It reached everyone. And it reached everyone because the trade routes reached everyone. So, did the catapulted corpses at Caffa spread the Black Death to Europe? The most honest answer historians can give is probably not in any meaningful way. Some corpses may have been thrown. Some fleas may have made the jump. But even if every detail of de Mussi's scene were correct, it was, in the end, a footnote to the pandemic, not its cause. The cause was the maritime grain trade, the rat and the flea. The Mongols did not weaponize the plague against Europe. The plague weaponized the trade route against everyone on it. And the ships that left Caffa in November of 1346 were only the first, most visible carriers of a process that would have happened even if Jani Beg had never marched to Crimea at all. Which leaves us with one last question. If the plague was going to reach Europe regardless, why does the story of Caffa still matter? It matters because Caffa is the earliest place in the historical record where you can see clearly and in miniature the pattern that has defined every pandemic since. A pathogen emerges from an animal reservoir in one part of the world. It jumps into a human system that was not built to notice it. It rides that system, the trade routes, the shipping lanes, the caravan networks, the airline hubs, into cities and populations that have no immunity and no framework for what is about to happen to them. And by the time anyone understands what has arrived, it is already everywhere. That is a lesson modern biosecurity has spent decades trying to internalize. It is why global public health institutions monitor animal disease outbreaks in remote regions. It is why the first thing epidemiologists asked in the early weeks of every recent pandemic was, what are the trade and travel networks connecting this outbreak to the rest of the world? Caffa is in that sense not just a story about the past. It is a rehearsal of the story we keep having. It matters too, because Caffa shows us something about how history itself gets written. The dramatic image, the corpse in the sky, is what survives. The systemic reality, the rat in the hold, the flea in the wheat, the trade route doing its ordinary work is what does the actual killing. Human beings then and now reach instinctively for the villain. It is more comforting to believe that a catastrophe was caused by someone's evil decision than to believe it was caused by the normal functioning of a system we all depend on. De Mussi in Piacenza in 1348 was doing what people almost always do in the face of unbearable events. He was trying to give the horror a face. And so we come back at the end to where we started. Picture Caffa again, in the late summer of 1346. The trebuchets on the steppe. The Mongol camp thinning out with every passing week. The walls of the city still holding exactly as their Genoese engineers had designed them to. And picture, if the scene ever happened, a single Mongol corpse arcing over the outer wall against the evening sky framed against the Black Sea beyond it. The image is real in the sense that it has traveled for 7 centuries. It is real in every classroom and every documentary. It is real in the way that stories are real. But behind that image, invisible on the horizon, another set of ships is being loaded at the harbor. Grain going into the holds. Rats climbing the mooring lines. Fleas that no chronicler will ever name. And when those ships raise anchor in November and sail out of Caffa's harbor toward the west, they are carrying something no catapult ever could. The machinery of a continental catastrophe, tucked quietly into the bottom of every hold. Gabriele de Mussi never knew about the rats. He never knew about the fleas. He never knew about Yersinia pestis. And he never knew that the story he was writing at his desk in Piacenza, to make theological sense of the death sweeping through his city, would end up outliving the empire of the Golden Horde, the Republic of Genoa, and the entire world in which his chronicle was written. What he did know, and what he tried in his own way to say, was that something had come from very far away, moving through channels no one had thought to guard. And by the time anyone understood what it was already inside the walls. That part, at least, he got exactly right.